Hi, welcome to Procreate 5, the basics of digital painting. I'm Flo, and you might know me from my easy to follow Procreate tutorials on YouTube. Here at Skillshare, I will be sharing longer tutorial videos, diving deeper into the world of Procreate. In this class, I will show you all the tools you need to know to create digital paintings in Procreate. And once I have showed you all the basic features, we will be doing a class project. We will be painting a realistic looking apple. I have some resources for you in the resource section, like brushes, a color palette, and a reference photo. In this class, I'm working on a 2017 iPad Pro 12.9 inch and using an Apple Pencil. Get ready to dive into Procreate. I will be guiding you through every step. The first time you open up Procreate, you will see some example canvases here, some example artworks. But soon, when you start with Procreate, this area will fill up with all your artworks. And of course, you want to keep it orderly and neat. Luckily, it's easy to arrange your canvases and to make folders. The way you can do that is by clicking an artwork, and then you can drag it around, and when you place it on another one and it turns blue, if you let go, it'll create a stack. And you can click it, and then you can give your stack a name, like Skillshare. But let's say you have a whole lot of paintings and you want to move them around, like a whole group of them. You can do that as well. If you hold one of your artworks, you can click other artworks and creating a stack which you can move around in any way you please. But this is not the place where the magic happens, of course. You will want to create a canvas to get started painting. To create your first canvas, go to the plus, and then you can either go for one of the standard canvas sizes that you'll see in Procreate, or you can create your own size by clicking on this little folder. And here you will be able to enter the pixel width and height of your canvas. You can also select a color profile. I would suggest to just keep it at sRGB and don't play around with CMYK. That's if you want to make prints. But if you're just using Procreate as a hobby, please just go for RGB, because that will give you the most vibrant colors on your screen. You can also adjust the time-lapse settings. Procreate creates a time-lapse video for you automatically when you're painting. And here you can set how big you want that video to be. And lastly, we have the canvas properties. You can set your standard background color or hide your background. This is not really important for now. But in case you always like to start on a black or a pink or a green background, then you can set that here, so you don't have to change your background color every time you make a new artwork. Once you have created your canvas, your screen will look quite different. Here on the left side, you have your sliders for your brush to increase or decrease the brush size and the opacity. And you can move this thing around by just pulling it out and taking it up or down wherever you like. When you go to Gallery, you will go back to the previous screen where you'll see all your artworks. Then we have this wrench. This is for all the settings and actions in Procreate. In the first tab, you'll find Add, where you can insert a photo or a file onto your canvas, or you can add text easily here in Procreate. The next tab is Canvas, where you can crop and resize your canvas, and where you can enter the animation and drawing guide options. You can also easily flip your canvas horizontally or vertically and go to your canvas information. Here you'll find how big your canvas is, but you can also go to statistics, for example, where you can see how many strokes you have made and how long you have been painting. You can also enter your name, add a little photo. You can see how many layers you can make and how many layers you've already have used. You can see your color profile and the video settings of that time-lapse video that I talked about earlier. Then we have the share option. This is where you will export your artwork. You can share it as a Procreate file. That way someone else could open it in Procreate and see all your layers. You can export it as a PSD file. This will also have layers. That's a Photoshop file. You can share it as a PDF, a JPEG, a PNG, which will have transparency. So if you have a transparent background, you can go for PNG or you can go for a TIFF. And you can also share layers or animations here. Then we have the video tab. Here you can replay your time-lapse. And you can also turn it off. If you don't want a time-lapse video of your artwork, then just turn it off here and you can export your time-lapse video. You can go for full length or you can go for a 30 seconds time-lapse video. Next tab is the Prefs tab or Preferences. Here you can switch to the light interface of Procreate, the right hand or left hand interface that will switch on which side these sliders are. You can turn on a brush cursor. That way you will see the shape of your brush when painting, or you can project your canvas if you want to share your screen. Here you can also connect a third-party stylus if you don't have an Apple Pencil and adjust your pressure curve. This will influence how hard or soft you can press your pen on the screen to make thicker or thinner lines, have more opaque or less opaque brush strokes. Just play around with this to see what you like best. And you can also go to gesture controls, and this will open up an entirely other menu. And here you can set all the gestures that you like. For instance, you could go to smudge and then you could turn on touch. That way, if you use your finger on the screen, that will serve as a smudge tool. And there are lots of settings here. For instance, you can see that copy and paste is set to 3-finger swipe for now. That's 3 fingers down on your screen and you'll get the copy and paste options. But if you like 4-finger tap, for example, or touch and hold, then you can change these settings here. Next to the settings icon, you will find the magic wand. Here you'll find all the adjustments you can make on your painting. We will dive into these later. Next to it is the selection tool to make selections in your artwork. Then we have the move and transform tool. Here, of course, is the brush menu. If you click that, then you will find a whole lot of brushes that are already in Procreate, and you can import your own brushes. Next to it is the smudge tool. Clicking this will open that same menu because you can smudge with whatever brush you like. And the same goes for the eraser here. And next to the eraser tool is the layers panel. Here you will find all your layers of your artwork. And finally, we have the colors menu, where you can select whatever color you like. To get started with painting in Procreate, you will want to use a brush, of course. And Procreate has a whole lot of brushes, and I would really suggest to just experiment with them to find your favorite brushes. You have the sketching brushes, inking, drawing, like a whole lot. One of the brushes that I like for sketching is the HB pencil. This pencil really acts like a real HB pencil. So let's check what you can do with a brush. First of all, you can adjust the size of your brush. You can make it very small and very big. And the closer your pen is to the slider, the faster your slider will go, as you can see. So you can adjust the size and you can adjust the opacity. A high percentage means that your brush stroke will be very opaque. And if you go down, you will get a very transparent brush stroke. And for some brushes, opacity or size is set to pen pressure. So if you press harder on your pen, you will get thicker and more opaque strokes. And when you press lightly, you will get less opaque strokes. And for some brushes, you will get thinner lines. Like the water pen, for example. If we use very little pressure, we'll have a thin stroke. And if we use a lot of pressure, we will get a thick stroke. Now let's go back to that HB pencil, for example. You can also adjust the tilt of your pen and get different effects. Like thicker strokes when you lay your pen down and thinner strokes when you use the tip. Now all brushes can be used as a brush, a smudge tool, or as an eraser. So we can erase with the HB pencil, for example. And you'll see that texture of the HB pencil when erasing. But you could also go to the soft airbrush, for example, which will give a different effect when erasing. And if you want to erase really fast, just want to get rid of everything, just swipe with 3 fingers to clear your canvas. And finally, you can also use the smudge tool with a brush. Let's first lay down some color with the soft pastel. And when we go to the smudge tool, we could also use the soft pencil as a smudge tool. And you can make these motions going from left to right, blending these 2 colored areas together. You can see that it kind of drags the color onto the other area. And like I said, just experiment with your brushes to check out the different effects. A tool that can be very handy in Procreate is the Quick Shape tool. The way to use it is by holding your pen in place when drawing. Let's just grab the monoline brush under calligraphy and let me demonstrate it. You can create all kinds of shapes using the Quick Shape tool. For example, you could create a straight line by holding your pen in place. And if you hold your finger on your screen, you can make a perfect horizontal line, for example. But you can also create a perfect triangle, for example, and hold your finger in place to create a perfect one. Same goes for a square. Hold your finger in place to snap it to a perfect square, or a circle, and hold your finger in place for a perfect one. And if you let go, then you can edit your shape by going to Edit Shape, and you can drag these handles, move it around, giving you full control over your shape. Then just go to your brush to get out of that menu. So the Quick Shape tool is super handy when you want to make clean looking shapes. Another tool you will definitely be using when creating digital artworks in Procreate are layers. You could see, or you could compare layers with transparent sheets of paper, which you can stack on top of each other and on which you can paint. You can move these transparent layers around, get one from the bottom and place it on top to change your artwork. Layers work that way. When you go to your layer palette, you will see this bottom layer, which says background color, and it's filled with pixels, with white pixels in this case. And you can click that layer to change that color. And then on top of that, we have layer 1, which is entirely transparent. If we turn off the background color, you can see that there's nothing here. So let's draw something on it, like a little heart. And then you can see that we have pixels where the heart is. Let's turn off that background color. Here are pixels, but the rest of that layer 1 is still transparent. And you can click the plus to create a new layer on top. And then you can draw something here as well. Now the pixels will cover each other and everything else on layer 2 is transparent. See? But we can also move this layer by dragging it underneath the other, and then the red one will be covering the purple one. So you can arrange layers by dragging them through this menu, and you can also group them. Selecting multiple layers can be done by swiping to the right, and then you can either delete them all or you can group them. This way you can move around groups of layers in your layer menu. And by swiping to the left, you can also lock your layer. That way you won't be able to paint on it anymore. So you can't paint on it by accident, for example. You can duplicate your layer or you can delete your layer. You can also set the layer blending mode here. You can do that by clicking the N, and you can switch your blending mode. For example, you can set your layer blending mode to add, and that will make everything lighter. Or you can set it to multiply, creating a darker effect. This is really something that I would suggest you play with. Experiment with layer blending modes or watch some other videos in which I will explain blending modes more in depth. Layer blending modes is really something that I would suggest you play around with, experiment with, to help you understand what they do. And they can really have some surprising effects. Let's go back to normal. Here you can also set the opacity of your layer. It's set to max by default, but you can go to the left with your slider, making your layer less opaque. So why are layers so handy? Well, it can be great to separate parts of your painting, a foreground and a background, for example. Layers enable you to work on different aspects of your painting. You can have layer 1 for your background, for example, paint every background thing on there, and then have a little character on layer 2, for example. It enables you to paint behind that character on your layer 1 without touching that character on layer 2. During our class project, you'll see what I mean. Some great layer tools that you can use are Layer Clipping Mask and Alpha Lock. Let me demonstrate it by using this apple, which we will be making in the class project. I have it in one layer here, and if we make a new layer on top, click that layer and then select Clipping Mask. This layer is clipped to the apple. You can see here that the apple has a transparent surrounding, and we just have pixels where the apple is. And this layer is clipped to those pixels. And now whatever we paint on layer 2 will only be shown in the places where there are pixels on that first layer. So if I paint on this layer, as you can see, I'm going all the way over. You can only see these lines right where the pixels are. And what's great about Layer Clipping Mask is that we can turn it on and off. We can adjust the opacity. We can adjust the layer blending mode. We can do all sorts of stuff with that clipped layer. We can do the same, kind of the same thing by using Alpha Lock. If we click the apple layer and click Alpha Lock, we will only be able to paint on the pixels that are already there. You can see that checkered board surrounding that apple. You can see that that's the area which is transparent. We can only paint on pixels. So just like before, our purple lines will only show up on the pixels. But when using Alpha Lock, you can't change anything right now. I can't remove it, I can't adjust the opacity, I can't change the layer blending mode. This is a destructive way of working. When I go out of my canvas and go back, I won't be able to undo this. You can only undo stuff while your canvas is open. So if you have the possibility, it's better to use a layer clipping mask. So why would you be using Alpha Lock then? Well, Alpha Lock can be handy when you want to decrease the amount of layers that you're using. Or perhaps you have a layer that is clipped to the apple, but you want to use Alpha Lock on that layer that is clipped. You can't clip a layer to a layer that is already clipped. So then the only way to do something like this would be by using Alpha Lock. Then layer masks. Sounds kind of complicated, but it's super easy and handy. You can add a layer mask to any layer. Just by clicking that layer and selecting mask, you get this extra layer connected to your initial layer, and it'll be completely white. White means you can see whatever is on that layer. It's like it's see-through. But when you start painting with black or gray on this layer, you will start blocking parts of this apple. Let me show you. I'll grab black, and now when we paint on this layer mask, it'll block that apple. And it's not like we're painting with white on this layer. It's truly blocking it, because if we deselect that background color, you can see that we can see through the apple. Now we can do the same with a gray, but then it'll only partly block. It'll be semi-transparent. And the great thing about layer masks is that it gives you full control. It's like erasing, but you can always go back. Because if we go to white again, we can get everything back. So it's like erasing or blocking with full control. Next, I'd like to talk about filling shapes. It might seem as if Procreate doesn't have a paint bucket tool, but this circle is actually the paint bucket tool. You can select a color, like red for example, and then you can drag in that circle to use it as a paint bucket tool. And now let's use a light blue, and let me show you the threshold. If you slide to the left or to the right, you can change the threshold of your color drop. And in this case, our lines are very smooth, so it doesn't really matter. Well, if you go to 100%, it'll fill everything. But this is very handy when you have like sketchy lines, which have a little bit of texture. Then changing the threshold can be very handy. Now for this image, I have filled the shapes on the layer itself, but you can also fill shapes on another layer. Let me undo this by tapping with 2 fingers. And let's create a layer below our line art. Let's drag it underneath. Now if we click our line art and select reference, this will be our reference layer. If we fill anything on layer 2, it'll kind of look at that reference and use that as lines. So if I drag in this color right now on that layer, it will fill the shapes that are on the reference layer. So this is very handy to get more control over your layers. And you can just fill everything in, all the shapes, and they are on another layer. And it's also handy because this, for instance, enables you to make a layer with clipping mask. When using clipping mask, you can paint on the layer with the colors without touching the lines, so it'll stay nice and clean. And of course, you could also make separate layers for each part of your illustration. You could make a new layer on top and have a layer for that little heart, for example, keeping things separate and keeping full control. Let's take a look at the selection tool. You can find it under the menu here. It's that S-shaped ribbon. And you have a variety of options when using the selection tool, like automatic to make automatic selections, the freehand tool to make a selection using your free hand. You can make all kinds of shapes, the rectangle and the ellipse. And when you make a selection, for instance, a circular selection like this, you can either add to that selection or you can remove parts of that selection. Let's add using the freehand tool. You can go like that, close it here, and now we have added a part to the selection. You can do the same with the rectangle tool. And you can also remove parts of your selection. So just click remove. Let's do the freehand again and remove a part of our selection. It's a really crazy looking selection right now. You can also invert the selection. So whatever is in the selection, well, it'll just invert and everything else will be selected. You can also copy and paste whatever is in your selection, and you can feather your selection. Using feather means you soften the edge of your selection, making it kind of like blurry. And you can save and load your selection in case you want to use it later on in your painting process. All you need to do is click that plus and you will have your selection saved right here. And you can load it at a later time. And if you're done making selections, then you can just use clear to clear your current selection. And what's so great about selections is that when you have a selection active, like this circle for example, is that you can only paint inside the selection. And that can be very handy. Let's just make a layer for that. And I'll use the medium nozzle under spray paints. And then you can see that we can only paint inside that selection. And that's great if you want to make very crisp looking edges, for example. Next to the selection tool in the menu, you will find the move and transform tool. That's that little arrow there. And you can use it to move whatever is on your layer, to move it around or to transform it. And we have some different options here as well. If you use freeform, then you can transform it any way you like, making your apple very thin, for example, or very flat. So you can do whatever you like. If you go to uniform, then the ratio of your apple will stay the same. If we use distort, well, the name says it all. You can distort your apple, pushing and pulling, making a weird kind of shape. And the same goes for warp. You can really warp your apple using these handles, making it very fat. And if you don't like what you just did, then you can just go to reset and reset your transformation. Now when you go to freeform or uniform, you can see these options. You can see magnetics, for example, and that's handy when you want to move your layer on a horizontal line or vertical line. Well, it kind of sticks like a magnet. So it makes it easier to arrange your items, your layers, your stuff. And you can also flip your layer horizontal or vertical, rotate it, or fit it to screen. And then we have bilinear here. There you can set the way new pixels are calculated when you resize your image. It's very complicated and math-like, but what you need to know is that nearest neighbor, well, it takes neighboring pixels deciding what color pixel Procreate needs to add. And this is a fast but less precise method of resizing. Bilinear is kind of in between. It calculates the average color of pixels surrounding a pixel, and bicubic, that's the most precise, very smooth way of adding pixels when resizing, but it takes more of your iPad. It takes longer. It's a more complicated calculation. It's so complicated that I can't explain it very well, but doesn't really matter. You can just set it to bilinear, but if you want to get smoother results, then you could try bicubic. And the Procreate magic just doesn't stop. Another great tool that you can use when painting in Procreate or drawing is a drawing guide. You can turn on a drawing guide by going to the wrench, then to canvas, and then turning on drawing guide. And when you go to edit drawing guide, you can create any drawing guide that you want or need. Here we have the 2D grid. And when you go to this slider, you can create lots and lots of lines, squares, or you can make it bigger, whatever you need for your drawing. You can also adjust the thickness of these lines, the opacity, making it more transparent, and also the color here on top. You also have the option to make an isometric grid, and again you can adjust the grid size. We have the perspective tool. If you want to create an image with perspective, you can just tap in your image to set a vanishing point. And then you can create multiple lines, create multiple vanishing points for your image. And you can just play around until you have a grid that's perfect for your drawing. And then we also have symmetry. That's very handy when you're lazy, I guess. That's very handy when you're lazy or when you just need to get something that is exactly the same on the left side and the right side. And when you go to options, you have all these settings for your symmetry tool. You can go to vertical, horizontal, quadrant, and radial, which is perfect if you want to create mandalas, for instance. You can also turn on rotational symmetry. You can really play around, check the effects. Now let's go to the 2D grid because I want to show you assisted drawing. For now, this is just a grid that you can follow with your lines, but if you turn on assisted drawing, then things will get even easier. Because whatever you draw, it will stick to these lines, making it super easy to create these perfect lines. And if you want to turn this off, then you can just go to your layer, click it, and turn off drawing assist. And then you can do whatever you like. And this also works for new layers. If you make a new layer and you turn on drawing assist here, again, your lines will stick to the grid. Colors. Of course, you need colors when painting. You can find those in the colors menu. And here again, there are different options. We have the color disc, which you can easily transform by using your fingers, making it big or small. And you can rotate your color. And then if you want to have this middle circle, if you want to make it bigger, then you can just pinch in and out. You also have the classic option, which will just take you to the color, and you can easily adjust the saturation and the lightness of your color. And you can also use these sliders. And in case you're wondering, what is history doing there? I don't have that. Not all iPads will show color history. I believe that only iPad Pros show color history. So if you don't have it, don't worry. That's because other iPads just don't have it. So there's nothing wrong with your version of Procreate. Then next we have Color Harmony. This is a super handy tool. It enables you to create color harmonies super easy. You can click the color harmony option here and you can go for complementary, for example, which enables you to pick complementary colors super easy. Those are colors that are opposite of each other on the color wheel. You can also go for split complementary. So that takes the neighbors of the complementary color. Then we have analogous. Not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but those are colors that are right next to each other on the color wheel. And we have triadic. That's 3 colors which are equally distributed along the color wheel. And tetradic, 4 colors distributed along the color wheel. And this makes it super easy to create color harmonies for your artwork. Then the fourth option is value. Now, this might seem a little bit complicated. You don't have to really do anything with this. You can just use this classic harmony, whatever. But what if you want to use some specific colors that you've seen somewhere and you've seen the hexadecimal codes? Well, this is the place where you can enter hexadecimal codes. You can just tap that here, enter your hexadecimal code that you need, click done, and you will have the color. And finally, you have the option palettes. This is where you can create color palettes. I have lots of color palettes here. And if you want to create a new color palette, you can just click the plus and give your color palette a name like Skillshare. And when you go to the disk and pick a beautiful color that you want to use, you can just tap in that color palette to drop it in there. You can just drop multiple colors, and when you click and hold them, you can move them around, or when you click, you can delete them. And if you want to share your beautiful color palette with the world, then you can swipe to the left on your color palette and share it. Or if you think your color palette sucks, then you can also delete it. Oh, and let's not forget that since Procreate 5 launched, you can also move around your color wheel. You can just grab it and place it wherever you like, grabbing colors close to your painting. And when you click that X, it'll move back to where it came from. I hope all the options in Procreate haven't made you dizzy yet, because there is more. If you go to the magic wand, you have lots of options to make adjustments, like blurring your image, for example, or adjusting the opacity. But I'm not really sure why that's in the adjustment menu, because you could also just go to your layer slider. But they put it there. And you can also blur your image by using Gaussian blur, motion blur, or perspective blur. And when you select a blur option, you can move your pen or your finger on your screen to adjust the amount of blur. You'll see the percentage at the top of your screen. So this is like, Gaussian blur is like taking off your glasses, making everything super blurry. Then we have motion blur. That's like when this apple moves by very fast, or when you're drunk or on drugs, I don't know. And the blur depends on the direction of your pen or finger. And finally, we have perspective blur. That's more like depth of field blur. For instance, when you use a camera with a high aperture, it's kind of like that. You can also use directional to make a directional blur. And again, just use that slider And you will find your focal point on that dot, and everything else will become more blurry. Other features you will find under the magic wand are sharpen. So in case you want to make your image a bit more crisp, you can go to sharpen and again just use your slider. You'll also find noise if you want to add a little bit of noise. Well, it looks like kind of like an old TV, but adding a slight amount of noise actually can add some interest to your image. So don't go overboard here unless you want to create a very old, noisy TV. Then we have the liquefy tool, and this is an interesting tool. It has lots of options to really mess with your image, giving it interesting effects. We have the simple option of just pushing, and you can adjust the size of your brush, and you can just push things around in your image as if you're pushing with your finger, and you can adjust the amount of pressure, gaining more control. If you turn it up to max, pushing and pulling becomes very easy, but if you turn it down, it'll go a lot slower. Then we have distortion. It'll distort the image a bit, like a ripple in water effect. And we have momentum, that's like speed. Really, yeah, it's really messing up that apple. But if we just use reset, we have our apple back. And I'd really suggest to just play around with these options. Like we have twirl right here. It can twirl your image just like it says. We have twirl left. If you want to twirl the other way around, pinch. Well, that pinches your image together, or expanding things. And you can combine these things like distortion and expand will create an effect like this. Then we have crystals, which also gives a strange effect. And just play around with distortion, momentum. You know, this is actually really relaxing. You can just mindlessly distort images, like meditation. You can also use edge. That will smooth, well, let's turn down momentum. It can smooth edges. Like if you want to make a nice looking edge here, if you go over that edge, you can see that we're losing those crystals. And you can use reconstruct to reconstruct parts of your image. It's like magic. If only this would work in the real world. Then finally we have adjust. If you want to, well, make the amount of liquefying, if you want to turn that down, liquefying your apple a little less or not at all. So you have full control here, and if you don't like it, just go to reset and we have our apple back. The last option that you can find under the magic wand is the clone tool, and you can use it to clone your apple or clone parts of your apple. With the circle, you'll decide what part you want to clone, and here you can select the brush that you want to use for cloning, and you can adjust the brush size and the strength of your cloning. So whenever we paint somewhere else than inside the circle, this part will get cloned. And it'll move along with our brush. Now, this is very big, but we can also make our brush very small and clone that area. Now, for an apple, this doesn't make sense at all, but it could be used when cloning grass, for example, in your painting, or complicated textures. Then cloning parts can be handy. You already know a whole lot about Procreate. Finally, I want to talk about adjustments, other adjustments that you can do. like hue, saturation and brightness, color balance, curves, and recolor. It's the step that you can take once your painting is finished and when you want to tweak some parts of it. With hue, saturation and brightness, you can change the hue of your image a bit or go really extreme and make this weird poisonous apple kind of look. And when we go to 50%, it's normal again. You can adjust the saturation of your image, going to grayscale or making it super saturated. And you can adjust the brightness, going all the way to white, as if it's gone to heaven. Or you can go super dark, making it black. And 50% is right in the middle and everything's back to normal. You can also go to color balance and you can, well, balance the colors. You can move around cyan to red, magenta and green, switching the balance of these colors. And you can switch from highlights to midtones to shadows. So they all have their separate sliders. So here are the shadows. We can make the dark areas more blue, more green, reddish. You can really play around with this. Then we have curves. It's also a way to play around with colors. On the left side, you'll find shadow areas, and the right side are the lights. And you can change these for red, green, and blue, or for the entire image. So we can darken the reds, for example, this way in the shadow area and lighten up the lighter areas. Also an option you can play around with. Then finally, we have the recolor option. You can use this to change a color in your image. For example, let's say we want to change red. I want to change it to blue. You can select the color here. And here you can select flood. You can use that slider to slowly flood your image. Flood those reds with blue. And you can go to the yellows then. And perhaps you want to make those more like orange. And again, you can use that flood meter, that flood slider to flood your image, creating this weird looking apple. And finally, once you're done painting your apple or whatever it is that you painted, of course, you'll want to export it. You'll want to share it with your friends, with your parents, with your dentist. You want to share it with the world. You'll have to go to the wrench and then pick one of these options. I usually go for JPEG if I want to share my image on Instagram, for example. You can click on it, then you have all these options to share your image. You can airdrop it, send it through mail, or you can save your image on your iPad to do with it whatever you like later on. Now, let's say you want to share your image on Instagram. Then you'll have to resize your image probably. It's smart to duplicate your artwork for that because you'll probably be making your artwork smaller. You'll have to go to your gallery, slide to the left on your image and then select duplicate. Now you will keep your bigger artwork and you will use the copy and make that one smaller. You can go to the wrench, then to canvas and then to crop and resize. For Instagram, I'll go for an image that is 1350 by 1080. Or when it's a square image, I will go for 1350 by 1350. Now, if you want to resize your canvas, you have to click Resample Canvas first. Then we can set this one to 1080. Then click done, because you can see that the ratio is not correct yet. It's not 1350, so we'll need to cut a part off. So I'll click done first, then go back to crop and resize, and then I will keep resample canvas off and turn this into 1350. And now I can crop my canvas to the correct size. And then I can go to share that JPEG and post it on Instagram. For our class project, we will be painting an apple. When you get started painting digitally, I think you should start easy. And I think food is the perfect subject for that. Everybody loves food, right? An apple like this has a simple shape, but it still enables us to practice adding light, shadow, a bit of texture. The perfect subject for this class. But of course, for the project, you can also pick another piece of fruit or another piece of food, whatever you like. During this project, we'll be using the tools and techniques that we discussed earlier in this class. First of all, our canvas. I have made a canvas that is 2500 by 2500 pixels. If you want to use the same brush sizes I'm using, then it's important to set your canvas to that same size. And then the first step is to get our reference photo. You can do that by making a secondary window on your iPad. You can do that by gently swiping up from the bottom of your screen and then sliding the app that you want to use, sliding that to the side. I'll be using Google Drive. And then we have our apple. You can just browse through your Google Drive or your photo app to go and grab your reference photo. And you can go for split screen or you can make it a bit smaller. I prefer the smaller size. And have your reference photo right there. Drawing and painting in Procreate is quite the same as drawing and painting traditionally. We will start with a sketch. And Procreate has some really nice sketching brushes, or actually pencils. We'll go for the HB pencil. That will be my go-to pencil in real life as well. And let's just grab a dark gray, almost black, just like real graphite. And the brush is at 100% opacity and the size is at 50%. And the great thing about this HB pencil is that it acts like a real HB pencil. So when you only use the tip of your pen, you will get very thin strokes. But if you use that side of your pen, you will get thicker strokes, just like a real graphite pencil. So let's sketch this apple. It's a pretty simple shape, a bit rounded. So the basic shape of an apple is kind of like a circle. And we are just making loose strokes. I'm using the side of the pen a little bit. And the great thing about painting and drawing fruit is that it's very forgiving. If one edge is slightly off, no one will really notice. But when you get started with painting portraits, then even if a slight thing is off, people will notice. But for this, we just want our painting to look like an apple. Or perhaps you'll be painting a banana or a strawberry. We can zoom out a little bit. And we can make it a bit bigger. Let's say you find your sketch a bit too small. You can just go to the Move tool, have it set to uniform, make it slightly bigger. Then we'll draw in that stalk, making it a little bit different than the reference photo. I want that to stick out at the top. And we have that shadow area here. You can sketch that in as well. And we can sketch in that shape of the red part of the apple. Like that. Once you have created your sketch, you can start painting. And we can do that on a layer beneath our sketch. And this is where digital art is so handy, and the usage of layers. Because when you paint traditionally, you'll have to paint over your sketch. But here we can just go below, and we can even adjust the opacity as we go by just clicking that N and moving that slider. That would be impossible if we were painting traditionally. Now for the painting part, first let's place a basic shape for our apple. We'll use the monoline brush for that, which you can find under calligraphy. And I have made a color palette for you, which you can find under the resources tab if you want to use the exact same colors I'm using, as well as the reference photo, by the way. You can find that under the resources tab. And let's just grab this yellow and we will make that basic shape of the apple. Let's make our brush 20%. And when you go to the brush settings, when you click monoline, you can see that I have streamline turned to max. That way you can make very smooth lines in case you tend to make a bit wobbly lines. So now let's follow that shape of the apple. I'll start down here and I'll follow my sketch, trying to make a smooth line like that, and then we'll fill it by dragging in the color. Now we can turn off, well, we can turn down the sketch a little bit so we can check our shape. And you can zoom in a little bit, make your brush bigger to 45%. And you can adjust some parts on the outline. You can rotate your apple just to smooth that outline a little bit. But you could also use the eraser. We're using that monoline brush now, and if you click and hold your eraser, you will be using that same brush as an eraser. Now we have the basic shape of the apple. And we'll use this base shape to start painting on. And we can do that by making a new layer on top of this basic shape and setting that to clipping mask. Now we don't have to worry about painting outside of that line. The apple will have a very crisp edge. We'll start painting on this apple using the basic flow brush, which you can also find under the resources. It's my favorite brush ever. It's what I use for almost all of my paintings. So let's get started adding some red to the apple, for instance. Let me make the brush 30%. And now we can just start painting from the bottom of the apple. You could also go a little bit bigger. You can go to 90%. We're filling that red space. And this is a pretty low opacity brush, so you can make multiple strokes building up that color. And the harder you press on that brush, on your pen, the more opaque your stroke will be. You can go along that edge. You can see how handy that clipping mask is here. And we're just following that sketch. Slowly filling that red area. And you can see in the reference photo that the light is hitting the apple from here. And on this side, it has a shadow. And there's also a drop shadow on the floor. Let's create that shadow on the apple itself. Let's first use this color, which is slightly darker than the yellow, to slowly build up that shadow. And right there, we can go a bit darker and use this shade. And we also see a dark part right there near that stem. So we'll have to make our brush a bit smaller. Let's go to 20% and use this dark color to paint in that part again, following that sketch that we made earlier. Now let's also add that little stem. We'll make a new layer for that, and we won't need to use layer clipping mask because the stem is a bit higher than the apple. So if we would use layer clipping mask, then this top part wouldn't be visible. We'll use this brown color for it, and I'll make the brush a bit smaller, 10%. To paint that stem. We don't have to give it any detail yet at this point. Let's go back to that apple layer, this one, layer 3, and also add a little bit of light. We'll use that light yellow for that. Let's lighten up that top part a bit. Make the brush bigger again, 40%. But you can just play around with size. You see light hitting here at the top part of the apple. Now that we have these base colors, we can start blending them a little bit. We can do that by using the smudge tool, and we'll use my basic blender. I have the size set to 55% and the opacity is at 40%. And we'll just go over these areas, making strokes and, well, following the shape of the apple. Just smoothing parts out a little bit. Just slightly. Now that we have a base for our apple, a base of colors and of lighting, we can start detailing our apple. Let's do that on a new layer. So we'll click the plus and then select clipping mask again. So whatever we paint will only show up on our apple shape. First thing I'd like to do is add a little bit of texture to our apple. And we can do that by going to Industrial and then using the Rusted Decay brush. And we'll pick this very dark red. I have the brush set to 7%, and let's go over those red parts of the apple. I'm using very little pressure. Let's add some texture there. and on the side here. This really creates some interesting texture on our apple. And we can do the same on this side. Let's pick the color by pressing our finger on the screen, holding it. And let's add a little bit of texture here as well. And it'll be very subtle since we picked that local color. We can make the brush a bit smaller to 3% and add some texture here as well. We can pick that darker green in our color palette, go to 7% again, and add slightly more texture here. We can go back to that yellow, for instance, and play around with the texture in this area a little bit. And now let's lower the opacity of our sketch, or well, let's just turn it off so it'll be invisible. And now we'll go over with the basic flow brush again, adding more detail to our apple. When painting, I always advise to work from the big shapes to the small shapes. So now we have our big shapes in place, we have the overall look of the apple, and now it's time to work on smaller details. So we can zoom in a little bit. We can even zoom in on the apple here a bit. And we can start working on it. Let me pick this red. And I have the brush. Well, let's set it to 35%. And I'll just work on these edges a little bit. I want to add that highlight. Let's first grab this orangey color. And because this brush is not fully opaque, you can easily blend the colors a bit with the existing colors, slowly building things up. Let me make a new color for our palette. A bright red for this area here. I'm using very little pressure on my brush. Now let's add that highlight. I'll make the brush a bit smaller, 15%. And with little dabs, I'll start adding that highlight to the apple. And let's also add more detail to this area here. Let's grab this very dark color and make our brush smaller, 10%. To work on this part a little bit. We can actually make our brush even smaller. Let's go to 4%. And it's important to look at the edges in your painting. For instance, this edge here, near that stem, that's a very sharp looking edge. But when you look at the edges here, for instance, you can see a smoother transition between that dark part and the yellow of the apple. And it's a thing you should always be aware of in your painting. Look at the edges, look at the transitions between colors. Is there a super fast transition, like here from yellow to very dark, or is there a smooth gradient? Let's draw in some of these little dots. Go even smaller to 2%, just to give this apple even more texture. And we'll go for dark spots on the yellow side. Like this, and we'll pick the yellow to make yellow spots on the red side of the apple. Like that. Of course, the stem needs some detailing as well. Let's zoom in there and let's go to that layer. First, let me clean up the edges a little bit. We'll grab the monoline brush for our eraser, make it pretty small, 6%, and go along these edges because we want a sharp looking edge there and not a smooth transition. Now we can start painting on this, and we could use layer clipping mask, but let's also demonstrate alpha lock. It kind of works the same. We can only paint on the pixels that are already on the layer. And we'll grab the basic flow brush again. And let's grab this orangey color. We have our brush set to 2%. And let's just add a little texture to that top part here. Maybe a little bit along the length of it. That looks better. Finally, let's add a drop shadow and work on the lighting a bit more. We'll zoom out, and we will have to make that drop shadow on a layer below our apple. So first click the plus to make a new layer, and then drag it all the way down below our yellow apple shape. And let's grab the soft brush, which you can find under airbrushing. And we'll grab this dark, almost black color. The brush size is set to 5% and the opacity is at 50%. That way we can slowly build up this shadow. can see that there's a very dark shadow underneath that apple, and it stretches out this way. But the darkest parts are right underneath that apple. So we'll have to make multiple strokes there, building up that shadow. To smooth the shadow a little bit, you could use the Gaussian blur. Under the magic wand, then go to Gaussian blur and slide to the right, just slightly, to let's say somewhere around 13%. And then you can go over again to darken that inner shadow even more. Let's go to 3% and make a very dark shadow right underneath that apple. Now, as you can see a little bit of yellow in that shadow. And let's add that as well. Let's use alpha lock on this layer, so we can only paint on the pixels that are already there. Let's keep it at the soft brush and pick a yellow from our apple. I'll make the brush a bit bigger, let's say 13%, and I'll go over that part just a little bit to add some slight yellow to that shadow, because the light, even in the shadow part, the light is hitting that apple, all the ambient light, and reflecting in that shadow. And things like this can really add to the realism. Let's also add a little bit of red to the bottom shadow. Let's make our brush 8%. Just a little bit of red there, like that. To get more of a painterly look on the apple, I would like to do something. I would like to merge the layers of the apple, or actually merge all the layers. Let me just group everything by selecting all the layers, and then I will duplicate this group by swiping to the left, duplicating it, and turning off this layer. This way our progress is saved. If in the next steps we do something that we don't like, then we can just go back to that group, because this group, I will be merging that. And now what we can do on this layer is blend colors, because when you use the smudge tool, you can only smudge colors that are on the same layer. I would like to turn off alpha lock, go to the smudge tool with my basic blender, and I'll zoom in a bit. Let's set our brush to 9%, and let's work on these edges, for instance, making some cross-hatching motions, blending that apple with the shadow just a little bit, making those lines a bit less obvious. And using the smudge tool, you can kind of push around colors. Like here for that yellow part, for instance, you can drag in parts of that yellow and drag them into the red part of the apple. Also here we can just play around with the brush size, making it bigger and smaller and pushing around those colors. But don't go overboard and smudge out all your details that you created earlier, all the texture. But you can drag in some of these lighter parts into those darker areas, for instance. And on this side as well. It nicely blends those edges of yellow and red. Now that we did this, we can start working on the colors a bit more and the lighting. We can do that on separate layers. To keep full control, you can use a new layer on top of our apple. Use the clipping mask, so whatever we do will only show up on the apple. And we can start by making a screen layer, for instance. We'll use screen to lighten some areas on our apple. We'll keep using the basic flow brush. And let's grab this light pink, for instance. Make the brush 20% and add some light, for instance, near this edge. You can see some reflected light there. So we can paint that in this way. Also down here, you can also see some slight light. Let's grab that yellow for that. Some light on this side. And here at the top, for instance, we can add some more light. And along that outer edge here. And a great thing about a layer like this is that it gives you full control. If you think that the effect is a bit too intense, then you can just click that S and lower the opacity of this layer. Let's go to 70%, for instance. And we can do the same thing with shadows. We can make a new layer, use clipping mask, and set this layer to multiply. Now whatever we paint on this layer will show up darker. So we can select a local color, for instance. Keep the brush at 30% and add some darker areas. You can make some shadows a little bit more intense. And because you're working on a separate layer, you get full control. You can just pick up local colors and go over areas where you want to darken things up a little bit. Or for instance, in the shadow, darken this a little bit. Constantly tweaking your painting. And again, if you just click that N, you can use the slider to make it less intense. Now finally, I would like to tweak the colors a little bit. Click the plus again for a new layer, use clipping mask, and set this layer to overlay. Now, on this layer, we can make our colors more intense. We'll use the airbrush for that. The soft brush, let's keep it, well, let's set it to 15%. Let's grab this intense red and go over this area, for instance, making it brighter, a brighter red. And you can do the same with the yellow, adding more intense yellow. And again, you have full control, so you can just go to the layer, click that O, and make it less intense. Let's go for 50%. And that way, using layers, you get full control over your painting process. So, for the project, paint your own fruit or other piece of food. If you would like to paint this apple, then you can find the photo under the Resources tab, along with the brushes and the color palette. And please share your result here in the class area. I would love to see it. I'm looking forward to seeing lots of food. If you have any questions, then please feel free to reach out. I'm here to help. And I'm also super excited to create more Skillshare classes for you. I will see you next time.